The midnight taxi. It was just past midnight when I stumbled out of the hospital, exhaustion weighing heavily on my bones. The autumn air bit at my skin, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Normally, I'd walk home to clear my head after a long shift, but tonight, fatigue won out. I hailed a taxi. As I slid into the back seat, I mumbled my address to the driver. He nodded silently, his face obscured by shadows. The radio played softly, a gentle hum in the background. I leaned back, letting my eyes close, the white noise lulling me into a state of half-sleep. I'm not sure how long I dozed, but something gradually pulled me back to consciousness. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed. Then it hit me, the radio. The soothing melodies had been replaced by something different. Something wrong. My eyes snapped open, and I focused on the sound coming from the speakers. It wasn't music anymore, nor was it any recognizable language. Instead, it was a series of guttural sounds, almost like chanting. The words, if they could be called that, seemed to slither through the air, wrapping around me like invisible tendrils. A chill ran down my spine, and I sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. I glanced at the driver, wondering if he had noticed the change. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. They seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. That's when I felt it. A weight on my lap that hadn't been there before. I looked down, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. Draped across my legs was a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid, but covered in what looked like a mass of tangled black hair, or was it seaweed? Or perhaps the detritus from some hellish sewer. The smell that emanated from it was indescribable, a mix of decay and something alien. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but my body was frozen in terror. The creature's face was inches from mine, though I couldn't make out any features through the matted mess covering it. One impossibly long, twig-like finger pressed against where its mouth should be, and a sound emerged. Shoo, shoo. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out more horrifying details. The creature's limbs were impossibly thin, like desiccated branches. Its skin, where visible through the matted covering, seemed to be coated in a layer of moss or fungus. This was no human, no animal, it was something that should not exist in our world. And yet, despite its apparent size and the way it sprawled across my lap, I realized with a jolt that I couldn't feel its weight. It was as if it existed just out of phase with reality, there and not there at the same time. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, this nightmare would be over. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, before I heard the driver's voice. "We've arrived, miss." My eyes flew open. The back seat was empty. The radio played soft jazz. The driver looked back at me expectantly, his face perfectly normal in the glow of a streetlight. Shaking, I paid and stumbled out of the cab. I made it to my apartment on autopilot, locking the door behind me. Despite the horror of what I'd experienced, exhaustion won out. As I drifted off to sleep, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by fatigue. For months, I managed to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind. I threw myself into work, picked up new hobbies, anything to keep my thoughts occupied. But in quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, the memory would creep back in. The guttural chanting from the radio, the creature's matted hair, its impossibly long fingers. I'd shake my head, trying to dislodge the images, telling myself over and over that it wasn't real, Then came the night that shattered my carefully constructed denial. It was a Friday, and my colleagues had insisted I join them for drinks to celebrate a promotion. I don't drink alcohol, but I agreed to come along. My friend Laith, who lives in the same neighborhood as me, was there too. As the night wore on, Laith indulged heavily in the celebratory spirits. By the time we decided to head home, he could barely stand. "I'll get us a cab," I told him, supporting his weight as we stumbled out of the bar. The cool night air hit us, and Laith mumbled something incoherent. I managed to flag down a taxi, and with some effort, got Laith into the back seat before climbing in after him. Laith's head lolled against the window, and he began to snore softly. I gave the driver our addresses and settled back, closing my eyes for just a moment. The events of the night, the loud music from the bar, the laughter and conversations, all swirled in my mind. I was tired, but content. It had been a good night. That's when I heard it. The radio. My body went rigid as the familiar, inhuman sounds filled the cab. My eyes flew open, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically. Laith was still slumped against the window. Nothing seemed out of place, but I glanced at the driver, trying to get a clear look at his face. In the dim light, his skin seemed unnaturally pale, his eyes dark hollows. As panic rose in my throat, the radio's garbled speech suddenly became clear. "Not of this world, not of this world." The words repeated over and over, a chilling mantra that seemed to seep into my very bones. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. But as the taxi turned down a dark, unfamiliar street, a strange mix of terror and determination seized me. I had to protect Laith. I couldn't let whatever had happened to me months ago happen to him. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I lunged forward, grabbing the driver's shoulder. "Stop the car!" I shouted. "Let us out now." The driver turned his head slowly, too slowly to be natural. His face, it wasn't a face anymore. Where features should have been, there was only a swirling darkness, like a black hole had opened up where his head should be. I screamed then, a primal sound of pure terror. I grabbed Laith's arm, shaking him violently. "Wake up!" I yelled. "Laith, wake up. We need to get out." To my surprise, the taxi pulled over smoothly. I didn't wait for it to come to a complete stop before I was clawing at the door handle. It opened, and I practically fell out onto the sidewalk. I turned back to pull Laith out, and he seemed to fall out of the cab as if pushed from within. The moment we were clear, the taxi sped off into the night, leaving us alone on a dark, unfamiliar street. Laith's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to fear as he took in my tear-streaked face and our surroundings. What happened? Where are we?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what had just happened? What had happened months ago? Would he even believe me? But as I looked at Laith, I noticed his complexion growing paler by the second. His eyes were wide, darting around as if searching for something. "Laith?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" He turned to me, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. "I wasn't asleep," he whispered, his voice shaking. The moment we got in the taxi, this thing climbed onto my lap. It was covered in black hair, or something like it. And it just kept saying shoo, shoo. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I've never been so terrified in my life. I felt the world tilt around me. I had never told anyone about my experience months ago. How could Laith have seen the same thing? We huddled together on the sidewalk, both of us shaking, both from the cold and from fear. Laith fumbled for his phone, calling his sister to come pick us up. As we waited, we talked in hushed voices, comparing our experiences. It was like it wasn't fully there, Laith said, his words coming out in a rush. I could see it, I could hear it, but I couldn't feel its weight. And its hands. God, its hands. They were like tree branches, all twisted and wrong. And there was something growing on them, moss, maybe? Or some kind of fungus. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and horror. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that someone else had seen it too. But horror at the confirmation that this thing was real. What do you think it was? Laith asked, his voice small and frightened. I shook my head. I don't know. But I don't think it was anything from this world. We fell silent after that, lost in our own thoughts. When Laith's sister arrived, we climbed into her car without explanation, both of us too shaken to speak. She must have sensed something was wrong because she didn't press us for details, just drove us home in silence. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, whatever was happening with those taxis, it wasn't done with us. And I didn't know how to fight something I couldn't even understand. In the days and weeks that followed, Laith and I grew closer. We were bound by a shared secret, a shared terror that no one else could understand. We researched obsessively, looking for any similar stories, any explanation for what we had experienced. We found tales of phantom taxis, of drivers who weren't quite human, but nothing that exactly matched our encounters. We became more cautious, more aware of our surroundings. We avoided taxis whenever possible, and when we had to take one, we were hypervigilant, ready to bail out at the first sign of anything unusual. We started carpooling to work, taking longer routes that avoided quiet, less populated areas. Life goes on. Laith and I still work at the hospital. We still take taxis sometimes, though we're always alert, always watching. And sometimes, out of the corner of our eyes, we catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. A flash of matted hair. A too long finger. A face that's not quite right. We don't know if we'll ever understand what happened to us, or why. But we know one thing for certain, the world is stranger and more terrifying than we ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, something is waiting. Watching. And whispering, shoo, shoo.